A dramatic and deeply concerning escalation is unfolding across the Middle East as tensions between Iran, Israel, and the United States intensify into what analysts now describe as a rapidly expanding multi-front war. What began in late February 2026 as a series of coordinated strikes has evolved into a sustained and increasingly unpredictable conflict, with both military and civilian targets now appearing to fall within its widening scope.
Recent developments suggest a critical turning point. Iranian leadership, particularly through its powerful military arm, the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, is signaling a shift in strategy, one that could dramatically increase the human and geopolitical cost of the war.
The current conflict traces back to late February 2026, when a joint U.S.-Israeli operation launched large-scale airstrikes on Iranian military and political infrastructure. Among the most consequential outcomes of those strikes was the assassination of Iran's supreme leader, Ali Khamenei, along with other senior officials. Iran responded swiftly, framing its actions under Article 51 of the United Nations Charter, the legal provision that allows self-defense in the face of armed attack. Tehran has repeatedly emphasized that its military campaign is retaliatory in nature, targeting what it calls aggression by Israel and its allies. However, as the conflict has progressed, the scale and nature of retaliation have evolved far beyond conventional military engagements. One of the most alarming developments is Iran's explicit warning that Israeli civilian shelters, long considered safe havens during missile attacks, may now be treated as legitimate targets. In a statement attributed to the IRGC, officials declared attacking our residential areas grants us the legitimate authority for your collective burial in shelters, the engineering layout and precise locations of which are in our possession. The message marks a significant escalation in rhetoric and intent. Iranian authorities claim to possess detailed intelligence on the design and location of Israeli shelters, including structural layouts and coordinates. The implication is stark. Areas previously regarded as protected spaces may no longer offer safety if the conflict continues to intensify. This shift has alarmed international observers who warn that deliberate targeting of civilian infrastructure could constitute serious violations of international law. Iran's messaging suggests that the traditional boundaries between military and civilian targets are eroding. Analysts note that this could signal a transition from deterrence-based retaliation to a doctrine of sustained offensive pressure. Recent statements from Iranian officials indicate that future strikes may include residential neighborhoods, civilian infrastructure, emergency shelters, and energy facilities. The warning also appears to be conditional. Iranian officials have indicated that any further attacks on Iranian cities could trigger direct retaliation against Israeli civilian zones, suggesting a rapidly evolving and highly reactive strategy. On the ground, the escalation is already visible. Iranian missile barrages have struck multiple Israeli cities, including Tel Aviv and other key population centers, causing casualties and widespread damage. These attacks have exposed vulnerabilities in Israel's sophisticated air defense systems. Despite historically high interception rates, some missiles have successfully penetrated defenses, injuring civilians and damaging infrastructure. In one wave of attacks, missiles struck residential areas, injuring civilians and causing structural damage to buildings. The use of advanced weaponry, including precision-guided missiles and coordinated drone strikes, has further complicated interception efforts and increased the risk to civilians. Experts warn that no missile defense system offers complete protection, particularly against coordinated waves of missiles and drones launched simultaneously from multiple directions. This has created a sense of growing uncertainty among civilian populations. What makes the current situation especially volatile is its expansion beyond a single battlefield. The conflict now spans multiple regions and actors, including Israel, Iran, Lebanon through Hezbollah, Gulf states, and U.S. military bases across the region. Iran-backed groups, particularly Hezbollah, have re-entered the conflict with renewed capability following extensive restructuring. Missile and drone attacks have also targeted U.S. installations in the region, placing American forces directly in the line of fire. Meanwhile, Iran has demonstrated its ability to strike deep into Israeli territory while simultaneously targeting regional assets, creating what analysts describe as a multi-layered battlefield where escalation is no longer gradual but accelerating rapidly. Iran's military leadership is increasingly framing the conflict as a long-term campaign rather than a short-term exchange of strikes. Statements from Tehran emphasize that operations will continue without limitation, suggesting a shift towards sustained offensive action. This broader strategy is also reflected in developments affecting global trade and energy flows. Key maritime routes have come under threat, and attacks on energy infrastructure have raised concerns about global supply disruptions. These actions have already had ripple effects across international markets, including rising oil prices and increased volatility. As the conflict intensifies, the human cost is rising sharply. Civilians on both sides are increasingly caught in the crossfire. In Israel, missile strikes have caused deaths and injuries, particularly when civilians were unable to reach shelters in time. In Iran, airstrikes have targeted key infrastructure in urban areas, contributing to significant civilian casualties. International organizations have warned that the deliberate targeting of civilian areas could escalate the conflict into a humanitarian crisis with long-term consequences for the region. Adding to the complexity of the situation is a shift in Iran's internal leadership. Following the loss of senior officials, new figures have emerged in key security positions, many of them closely tied to the military establishment. This consolidation of power among hardline elements is expected to reinforce a more aggressive approach to the conflict and reduce the likelihood of diplomatic de-escalation in the near term. Alongside military actions, rhetoric from Iranian leadership has grown increasingly confrontational. In a direct message to the United States, a senior Iranian commander warned, "Do not call your defeat an agreement." He continued with another pointed statement, "The time for your empty promises is now completely over." Such remarks reflect a broader narrative being promoted by Tehran that the conflict represents a decisive turning point in regional power dynamics. Iranian officials have framed the confrontation not just as a military struggle, but as a wider geopolitical and ideological contest. The language used in these statements underscores a growing sense of finality and determination, suggesting that Iran views the conflict as part of a larger strategic shift rather than a temporary escalation. The global implications of the conflict are already becoming apparent. Energy markets have been particularly affected, with oil prices rising amid fears of supply disruptions. Strategic waterways remain under heightened tension, and shipping disruptions have added to economic uncertainty. At the same time, global powers are closely monitoring the situation, with concerns growing about the risk of a broader regional war. Diplomatic efforts have so far struggled to keep pace with the rapid escalation on the ground. Perhaps the most troubling aspect of the current situation is the absence of a clear path to de-escalation. Iran's leadership has indicated that its campaign will continue until its strategic objectives are achieved. At the same time, Israel and the United States have shown no indication of stepping back. The result is a conflict that appears to be accelerating rather than stabilizing, with each new development increasing the risk of further escalation. What is unfolding is no longer a series of isolated incidents, but a sustained and expanding confrontation with significant consequences for regional and global stability. The potential targeting of civilian shelters represents a profound shift in the rules of engagement, raising serious legal, ethical, and humanitarian concerns. At the same time, the expansion of the conflict across multiple fronts, combined with increasingly aggressive rhetoric, points to a prolonged and deeply destabilizing confrontation. For civilians across the region, the implications are immediate and severe. For the international community, the stakes are equally high. The coming days will likely determine whether this conflict can be contained or whether it will continue to spiral into a broader and more devastating war.